talk about Composition API. But before we start, I know it's kind of a small group here so far. How many of you have used Vue before? Pretty much everybody. And how many are using Vue 3 right now? None. Everyone's using Vue 2? Raise your hands. Okay. Luckily, what we're going to talk about works with Vue 2 as well, but it's more prominent in 3. So in case you don't know who I am, I'm a local coach here in Atlanta. I made a movie. I'm a board member of the .NET Foundation, yada, yada, yada. There'll be a link later on to my blog if you want to read more. So to me, there's an important question. When the Composition API first was sort of announced, I was upset about it because I learned all this stuff about the Options API, and then suddenly it didn't work anymore. Would you like me to say again? Oh, it's not working? Maybe I hit it too many times. Testing? Is that better? Okay. So I invested quite a lot into Vue 2, and maybe, do those doors close? Is there any chance someone can grab those? Oh, that makes a big difference. Thank you. So I had invested a lot of time in Vue 2 and had gotten comfortable with what they call now the Options API, or what used to be called the way you wrote Vue apps, right? And so at first I really didn't want to move, and I'd looked at the class composition model as well, the class-based, which is sort of Angular does it, therefore we need to do it, sort of option that they built and then now have deprecated. So I wasn't all that anxious to learn something new. And when I started to look into it, I realized how important it would become to me, that it becomes a sort of tenet in a better way to build Vue apps. And so that's what I'm here to sort of try to convince you of. We're going to spend a lot of time in code, but let's walk through a couple of slides first. So the two other ways Options API works in 2 and 3. So this isn't going away. They're not asking you to rewrite your whole application. But it is hard to extend it. The whole plugin facility is weird, frankly. TypeScript is really hard with the Options API because it's all very loosely typed. And the this pointer gets magically molested constantly in Vue. And so knowing what's in that this pointer can be very confusing, and you kind of have to take it faith until you run it and like, oh, I guess it works, or oh no, it doesn't work. How do I find out how to fix it? The class-based API, I talked about, decorators are just hard to debug in general, and I think that class-based APIs, I think Angular sort of fell in this space as well, thinking that coming from an object-oriented space like C# or Java, that everything needed to be a class, because that's what a lot of us were used to. And so applying something like Angular where everything is a class felt right, but it wasn't very JavaScript-y, frankly. Classes are great and can be used in great ways, but not everything needs to be a class. So what is the Composition API? It's trying to use JavaScript in the way that JavaScript actually works. It's a more natural envisioning of how JavaScript works. It really depends on closures instead of magic. And so it's much more easy to debug because you're dealing with a scope in JavaScript instead of, again, this magic of this pointer. You can simplify it even further using setup scripts, and I'll talk about that a little more. That tends to get into the magic territory for me a little bit, so I'm not really using setup scripts. I don't love them, but they're there if you want them. Fully supporting TypeScript to me is a big, big win. It makes it a lot easier for me to more quickly develop when I know what the nature of the objects I'm dealing with is, and I'm using interfaces for data types and things like that. And reactivity is more obvious. This is the whole notion of how you deal with change is convenient when you look at the Options API, or even the way some of other frameworks do it. But this is the sort of pain point a lot of people are like, I don't have to think about it. I just want to use my objects. I just want to use my objects. And unfortunately, we sort of have to opt into it. And this is going back years and years to different frameworks. I had to deal with this same sort of thing in C++ and MFC back in the mid-90s. So, I mean, this problem of how you deal with reactivity isn't new. And I actually like that it's more obvious. You know what you're getting into. So that's all the slides. Is everyone clear, or do you want me to write code? Okay, I'll write code. Just a joke. I'm going to write code whether you want me to or not. So I'm using Vue 3, but essentially what I'm doing here isn't really any different from Vue 2. The composition API is something you can add onto Vue 2. There's a package for composition API to enable it. And one of the interesting things is that not everything in your project needs to be using the composition API or the options API. They ultimately compile and run in the same sort of way. It's really about the development experience that's different. And so, is that text big enough, or you want me to make it a little bigger? Good? Okay. Let's get rid of that so you can see a little more. So I'm going to start with I have a really simple app. Let's show you what it does. And then we're going to refactor it to using the composition API. This is just a bookcase, and you can add items to your books. And I'm glad it wasn't mine. You can just add, remove books. It keeps them. It keeps a library. It's a really simple and frankly ugly app, right? I didn't want to get involved in any of the CSS nastiness, but we have a library which we haven't implemented yet, and then we have books we can add and remove. Nothing all that dramatic. So I have and want to stop going to that page. I simply have a router with a couple of pages. We're not going to really deal with the routing part. And currently, I'm using the options API in a pretty typical way. I have components, I have data, I have computed, mounted, methods, nothing all that dramatic. I could be using stores and all that sort of thing, but it's a pretty simple off-the-shelf app. And this works, but we tend to have to get into this sort of magic that because we are creating a book's object and data, that it magically becomes part of this pointer. And then we get into this nervous part, like here in mounted. The mounted has a this.books, but if I accidentally had created this as a function, what happens to this pointer? I have to do some magic to sort of make it work, right? And so, let's go back on that. Having to rely on this pointer, to me, is part of the confusion here of not knowing what. So let's change this to a composition API. Composition API really involves just another member of the options API called the setup the setup method. Right? And what happens in the setup is all the structuring of the app. And so let's start by taking all this data we have, and I'm just going to change these to const. Whoops. I know you don't want to watch me type, but I like doing pair programming with 20 people at a time. And I just paved this machine yesterday, so there's liable to be something awful going on with it, but we'll see how that goes. So we have our data, and then let's go down to methods. Methods are a good place to start. So I'm just going to take these from the methods, and I'm still going to create them as functions. And however you want to define functions, you could do properties with lambdas, or you could make them actually first-class functions. They're just function objects, right? If I could spell function. Actually, I don't need semicolons. And the big change here is that instead of the this pointer, I can actually just use them because, of course, the data is exposed outside of those functions, and you're in a scope that is visible to the inner part of the function. So that closure of the object at the top to the object in the bottom. And don't worry about the squiggly brace. We'll talk about that in a minute. But let's just change this to that, right? And so this becomes a little bit more apparent, because when you're looking at total clicks, it knows what it is. It isn't this magic thing on the this pointer that's been added at runtime. It's something that actually exists. Of course, it doesn't like total clicks plus plus because it's a const. By itself, this will run. It just won't be reactive. All this data we're dealing with is not reactive. So as it changes, the UI won't know about it. So we have to do something to decide what data, because not all data needs to be reactive, but in our case, these three elements need to be reactive. And so we do that by bringing in two classes, or two methods. One's called ref, and that's where you're going to create a reference to typically a scalar type, ints, strings, etc. And then for the others, it's going to be reactive. Now, reactive, let's talk about ref first, and I'll get into reactive, because they're actually really simple in the way they work. And so let's bring in those using statements. Do the same for ref. So here, that total clicks now being a ref, what we have to do is actually call value on it. So the object itself is a wrapper around the scalar types, and then dot value will get at the real object. And the reason for this is so that when you change the value, it can tell Vue that it's changed, therefore to update that part of the UI. That's all the magic is. There's no other magic element of ref. It's just that you have to call dot value when you want to change it. That's it. You can also register for events when it changes if you need to do your own thing. But at the 99% case is to just call dot value instead. Now reactive are interesting because reactives are just proxies. They're just proxies. So you don't actually have to change the way you're going to work with proxies. But it does mean that I've made them const because the proxy is const. I can't change that proxy, but I can call methods because the object inside the proxy is mutable. The proxy itself is immutable. Does that make sense? And so in that case with reactive, I don't have to change anything. That's why we don't get any squigglies except for the .ref. Right? And at the bottom of setup, I've created this scope. I need to tell Vue what is the exposed surface, right? And we do that by returning an object that has each one of these. And you can create them inline. I like this. I think it's a little more readable, so I'm going to go your books. I think it's books, yeah. Total clicks, add, remove, and has book. And there's some other clever ways to do this, but this is typically what you're going to see in the composition API. You're essentially saying this is the surface area what I can bind to. And notice it doesn't care whether it's data or actions. They're all treated as just other objects that you can access in the markup, right? And so now that we have that, we have one more piece. Let me get rid of data since we've done that. We have two more pieces, actually. So let's talk about mounted. We have this mounted here. And what we can do is create a method here called onMounted. And this is, let's see if it automatically added it. This is a function that comes from Vue as well. So it's well typed. And onMounted just says, hey, do some work when this is mounted, right? It's depending on that closure as well. So you don't have to worry about this pointer being molested by nested objects or any of that. And we don't need to expose this because onMounted isn't bound to, right? It's just called when this thing is mounted. So we don't need to change it or return it at all. It knows when it's calling onMounted, it registers it. so that when this view is mounted, it calls this code, and this code has access to the pieces in it because the closure is going to keep it alive. That's it. Again, we're just talking about plain old JavaScript, or TypeScript, if you will. And the last one is computed. And in that same vein, there's a computed which is another function exported by Vue, or Vue composition API if you're in 2. And all it does is allows you to say, this is a method that when it changes, I want you to reassess this. So when the objects inside of it are changed, value.count or length. Right? And what is the computed again? What do we call it? Tick count? Book count. Oh, I got it wrong as well. Sorry. So this computed, because we're going to bind to it, is going to be a const as well, because the computed object is immutable, but inside is going to change. And then books dot length. And I don't need value there because it's a reactive. Arrays tend to be reactive because you want all the methods to be intercepted. Every time one of the methods that are called that change the state, it does the reactivity for you. Ref is really, again, about scalar types. And so let's add book count down here. Let's get rid of that one and the mounted. So we don't need them anymore. And so our code, even though it is an options API, we're still doing things like the components, just like we always have. The setup becomes where we're doing all that real work, where we can really see what we're dealing with. And in that same way, all of this continues to work, because the surface area is effectively the same. I haven't changed any of the markup to make this work. In fact, we come back here. It all continues to work, right? So we've effectively taken this idea that we're used to and moved it into something that I feel like is a little bit easier to get my head around what is actually happening. It's obvious instead of obfuscated. Well, let's take this one step further, right? Let's take some of our data here that has to do with the your books, and let's create a new just store object. And I'm just going to expose an object, and that's going to have our books. And I'm doing this so I can save it, so I can share it. And just because we're outside of Vue, just because we're in a normal object, doesn't mean we can't still use reactive and ref, right? We're creating objects that care that way. And add, remove, and has books can all live there as well, because they're about the your books, right? So let's change this a little to be an object, or actually let me take that back. I'm going to create them in the scope. Of course, we're not doing the total clicks because that's not important there. And then we're returning a default of your books. And there are other ways to do this. I could have a function that generates this if I wanted to have more of a factory pattern. This is more of a static pattern. Or this could be Vuex as well. Like, it doesn't care what it is. Add, remove, has book, right? And all that should be good. And then what happens here, right? We say import store from store. And these composed pieces, again, composition API is a name for on purpose is, right? Just take the members of that object we're getting back and attach them there. So it becomes this way to compartmentalize the different functionality you have in here. This code becomes simpler, and you have a separate file for all the functionality that needs to be shared or that you want to compose separately. And let me make sure it still works, that I didn't screw something up, because that has happened before. Right? And so, at its core, we're talking about changing the fundamental way, so there is going to be some moving of the cheese. But we still have this problem of, is this code going to be more maintainable? Because this all works in TypeScript as well. So I find that things get to be more natural. Like this mounted, I want it to make more sense than this. So I could have done this in the options API as well. But I tend to find myself using this more often, right? Let's get the result. And then our code becomes really simple because there isn't any worry about what's happening to this pointer. Of course, I called it response. And whether you're using fetch or Axios, it doesn't really matter. Or whatever library you end up using. I feel like I've missed, oh, there we go. Right, our code becomes even a little simpler here because we can use modern JavaScript techniques. We're still compiling, we're still doing all those things. This does assume that if you're doing Vue 2, you are using the CLI, you're using something that supports compilation. Now, a lot of us, if we're using these single file components, already are using the CLI or using Vite or one of those other solutions, or just using Webpack to get some of this benefit. But this isn't only limited to inside of single file components, right? Because this is just the way to create that object, and ends up being hopefully much simpler. And the difference between 2 and 3, if you're thinking about moving your project later, is that the only thing that changes going from 2 to 3 is changing the view from Vue/composition API to Vue. All the interfaces are the same. There's a couple of small little niddling changes that are sort of edge cases, but 99% of it is completely 100% compatible on both platforms. So when you are ready to go to 3, and there's some other reasons to go to 3, you can really gain the benefit of using composition API. I thought I saw a hand for a minute. Did you have a question? Yeah?
I feel like your book count broke more.
It could have.
More books shows 0 in the top line.
Yeah. This actually is the click count. I was inventing a ref I could use, and I deleted those, so they're not working. This was never actually a count of the number of books, believe it or not. And so that gets into some of the, what was the other piece I wanted to talk about? Yeah, and so this does not need to be a holistic change, right? Because our book control is still using the option syntax, right? We may have a bunch of controls out there that aren't going to benefit from converting, or maybe just new developments in Composition API. It doesn't care. So this isn't Angular JS to Angular 2, the way I kind of describe it to you. They didn't change the world, they just made a different option for doing it. And if you're continuing to use the option syntax and you're comfortable with it, don't change. This is just another option. It's not going away. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, for this new version, using the composition API, what's the reason behind not including by default the Reactives and ref? Because they seem to be like something that you are going to use almost all the time. But I saw that you needed to import it. I mean, now we have mounted, we have the new setup, but why they did not include the Reactive and ref? I mean, those imports, are they, I don't know, affected?
You mean in the new template, or what do you mean?
If you go to the code that you just was modifying, I saw that you needed to import the Reactive and the ref.
Correct.
Why are not they included by default?
Included where?
In the same way that we have the unmounted or the setup, you don't need to make an import. They are by default included in Vue.
Well, they're not. In the option syntax, they're using that you have a mounted property to imply that. And so the composition API is going to rely on importing of all those pieces. It's not just ref and reactive. If we look at the code real quick, just to be really clear, ref, reactive, unmounted, and computed all need to be imported because they are the pieces of the composition API we're using, because we're using them because there isn't a structure that we can imply. So that the option syntax is relying on the convention of, oh, there's a mounted property I'm going to use in this way. Instead, we're going to bring in the piece and know exactly what code is. So this is more work, albeit not a lot more work, but it is more work. And some people also do this, which is bring in the entire Vue object, and then these just become Vue.reactive, right? I don't prefer that style. I like to dereference almost everything I can do. But it's more of the ECMAScript 2015 and beyond that this is the style of JavaScript now, that there isn't anything implicit in the namespace anymore. And you'll see this throughout Vue 3, in fact. I know this isn't a Vue 3 talk, but I'll just so I can kind of explain it. Like the new mounting syntax, which I'll talk about at 1:30, I think, are imported methods from Vue that we're creating. There is no global scoped object anymore, which means we can create 6 of these in a page without having to do some weird things about the one global view. Like this is moving towards a more flexible environment. And what you're noticing is the side effect of that. But this is the way that more modern JavaScript is being written today. And so they're sort of moving there. But they are moving your cheese, you're gonna have to get used to it. Like there's no getting around that. There's no getting around that. Before I go on, anyone else have any questions? I'm never that clear. Go ahead. You. There wasn't another hand.
Advantage of that. So for the composition API, we can use TypeScript, you mentioned.
Yes.
Okay, so if I have a project right now ready in Vue version 2, and I want to move it to version 3, for taking like the most of the framework itself, should I also include all the interfaces and everything else for taking advantage of TypeScript, or? Only
when it's going to help you maintain your code better. Like TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. So all JavaScript is valid TypeScript, right? That is the way it works. And so for me, having, let me pull up another project just to show you TypeScript. No, that's tomorrow's talk. Where is it? It was the right one, I just forgot about it. So in this way, I'm doing something very similar with this control that we saw in our example, but this is TypeScript, right? And so being able to use TypeScript where I need to, like having the items not be able to be typed, assigned a false type, I'm going to get benefit out of that. Or even using Axos, knowing what the result interface is so I can more easily know that I'm calling the right methods. I'm not going to use TypeScript or create types for each and every object in my code base unless there is a payoff, right? But luckily, like if you're using Code or Visual Studio, there's also a paste interfaces. So it's really easy to grab a piece of JSON and paste it as interfaces in your code so that that part becomes relatively simple as well. But figuring out where that is, what you're also getting is type safety in the framework so that you're getting better understanding of methods and properties and all of that. So some of it is more about IntelliSense than it is necessarily type safety, but you're gaining the benefit of both. Because ultimately this, at runtime, there is no type safety, right? This is all about compilation time safety, finding bugs before they become runtime bugs. Does that make sense?
One other question.
Yeah.
Are the functions on the composition API setup exposed for a parent component, so we can call it by reference or something like that?
Say that one more time, I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, so let's say that I have a component with using composition API. From a parent component, can I call the functions in the setup or call any functions on the child? Sorry, from the child?
Yes, the same facility for doing like refs are supported there. So one of the things that might not have been obvious, because I didn't show you, was in the composition API, there are pieces you can add here, and the first one is props, right? So if you need to get at the properties, the first parameter of the method is a property object, so you can go in and manipulate them. And in the same way, there's a second object that is actually options. And options has a few different pieces on it. It has emit, instead of there being a magic $ emit. There's also refs. And so a ref is when you want to call runtime component calls from that. Really the same way we do refs today, just we're getting through it through these properties of the setup. They're being passed in, things that are defined before the setup is called, right? Because setup is being called after the parsing of the template and before mounting happens. So really at the create call. One thing you'll notice in the composition is there is no create event anymore, hook, because setup is it. You don't need create because create is setup. It's the same thing, so they haven't created one that's special. Most people have either moved their stuff to mounting or leave it in the setup. So I spent a little time looking for on create, only to realize that they were smarter than I was, which has happened before. Any other questions before I get back to you?
So I'm trying to figure out what's better about this. I feel like the way we pulled in the store is nice, but we had mix-ins before that could do the same thing. You alluded earlier to perhaps confusion around what this is, depending on where you're at. Is that it, or is there more?
Well, I think that the code is easier to debug because you're not having only the wire up of those specific state parts. Like being able to set a breakpoint on the data elements if you're not using a data callback, for instance, is a common approach there. I feel like that the code I write in composition is easier to maintain over time, and that's really what it is. And if you don't feel that way, that's fine. Like mix-ins are ones that I've always had sort of an issue with because they're prescribing how a mix-in should work. Whereas here, I can choose any pattern I want to get those objects into the setup and use them. Instead of having a mix-in having this very prescribed, rigid way of creating a mix-in. Mix-in comes in, really all the mix-in is doing is allowing you to add stuff to this pointer magically, right? That's essentially what it's doing. And instead of that, going, I don't really want this, I want to late bind it, which mix-ins don't really allow you a great facility to do. So I might have a factory pattern that's only executed once someone clicks that button or once some event happens, or because it might be an expensive operation or whatever it may be. It gives me more flexibility because it's just JavaScript. Now, no one's, to your point, if you don't think you're going to get a lot of benefit out of this, you don't have to use it. But I would argue that if you give it a chance, you'll get more comfortable with it than I ever was with the option syntax. Like I would challenge you to give it a chance, and I think you'll find, because there is very much the like, what the heck are they doing that occurs to me, and this is a natural learning curve that I run into with every technology. I don't know if you've heard me give this example before, but it's this curve of learning something new, and it starts with they're stupid, and then it goes into I'm stupid, and then suddenly I reach a plateau where I'm like, oh, I get it, right? And getting past that they're stupid and the I'm stupid part is so key to me. And that's what happened with the composition API. I was like, they're trying to be too smart, they're trying to be until I started having to go back to code I wrote 3 months ago and was like, oh, I know what this is doing now. I don't have to sort of dig in or debug to figure out what it is. It became more apparent. And that the setup may end up being very small, because the other thing you're getting here is testability. If a lot of your composed parts of your application are these plain old JavaScript objects, I can write tests against them a lot easier than instantiating a view and trying to call methods on it. And in reality, if you look at the store, nope. We look at the store. I know I should put my glasses on. Right? Nothing in here except for the ref is very Vue-like, right? And so I could certainly run tests against this. In fact, let's make it completely Vue-less. This is the part that makes it a little crazier. Let's take out the reactive, right? And then in home, we can say const the store equals reactive store. Right? So that whole object becomes reactive, and then we can write tests against plain old JavaScript code to see how it works, right? And so to me, these are the kinds of flexibilities that you may or may not need. If you're building small little components to do counters or to-do lists or things like that, this feels like more work. It feels like there's more, having to have more knowledge. When you start looking at larger projects where you're composing, 20 forms, 100 components, a bunch of filters, a bunch of controls, I think you're going to see that there is a payoff here. And I'm happy in 6 months if you get back to me and go, you were wrong. I think it didn't help me, just made life more difficult. I'm happy to be wrong. It's happened before, at least my wife tells me that. Did you have another question?
Yes, right now I have an application reading Vue 2, and I've been hesitating about migrating to the composition API because the state of the application, I don't know how painful it could be. I'm using Vuex. Vuex is amazing, it's my favorite state manager, but do you have any thoughts about how painful could it be, if it will be worth it to do it?
Again, the option syntax continues to work. The move from Vue to, let's talk about them separately. So the move from options to composition can be incremental. So you don't need to convert code that works. Like, I'm not a fan of going through and trying to change everything to the option syntax, because that's work that you could be doing and making the app better in some other place. But taking the piece of, we need to tear apart this control and make it better, I might convert it at that point, but I would not worry about wholesale converting it. Going from Vue 2 to 3, you're going to see performance increases, and a lot of the changes between them are about plumbing. And so you need to change the way you're the way you're bootstrapping it and some things like that, but a lot of the components end up being the same. The big pain point going from 2 to 3 is library usage. There's some libraries that just haven't gotten there yet because they're trying to do wholesale changes going from Vue to 3, the big one being Vuetify that usually bites people. If you're using Vuetify, you're stuck until they get around to updating. And they're working on it. Just they're trying to fix everything they didn't like about the old one instead of converting it to 3. Which maybe should have been 2 different operations. But I'm not volunteering on it, so take that for what it's worth. Like, I could be digging in if I had time to help.
Is using Reactive and maybe Rep overcome some of the problems with reactivity, like adding a property, a root level property to an object, or I always have to look it up. There's a rule about putting another element in an array, and will it get recognized? Does this overcome some of those?
I think so, because I haven't had an issue since I moved over to it. Does that mean we're not going to still run into bugs? No, but 2 things about this. We still need to be aware that it's reactive, and that's where, like, using const here in books, because you notice I use splice here just like I would have in Vue 2 with the option syntax, because as soon as I try to do what I really want to do, which is that, it's going to complain because the reactive object is immutable. If it goes away, Vue doesn't know about it anymore. And so to me, it's more obvious that I've screwed it up because I'm making sure that the ref and the reactives are constant. But that's, again, more of a nature of this being JavaScript versus the options API, is it's being more obvious because the reactive wrapper is a proxy. So every method that goes in and changes state will cause the reactive change, right? And so it's a little bit, to me, more obvious. When I'm digging into the options API and I'm looking at one of the members, I'm like, is this reactive or isn't this? And there's actually tests in the composition API, is ref, is reactive, so that I can tell and actually make decisions about whether it's reactive or not. Do you have a question?
Yeah, what you asked just reminded me of like something I really hated when I would introduce somebody who's new to Vue to a code base and they'd start working in it and they'd have a problem they'd work on for a while and I'd be like, okay, you're gonna hate this. You need to use like Vue.$set to get what you think is gonna work to work. Like you said,
right.
We're getting a new property and an object to be reactive. And it's like, all of a sudden this thing that looked like it was simple has this wrinkle, and every time, the first time you encounter that, it takes forever. But the way you're able to set things on the object here doesn't require $set, and that is a big thing.
And it's discoverable, whereas $set was never super obvious to me.
Yeah.
No, every time I had to do it or explain to somebody, I was like, oh my god, I know what you've been through for the last hour.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I want the compiler to help me, and $set, the compiler never helped me. In this case, I feel like whatever IDE you're working in, you're going to get that facility of like, oh, I'm not allowed to do this. Why? Let's figure it out. Oh, this is a ref. Like it hints me at the right direction instead of running and going, well, why isn't it changing? I set a breakpoint there. It's clearly changing, right? Those pain points are what made me want to rip my hair out, and it's still growing back, 3 years later. And so, I want to sort of end this, and you'll be able to get a copy of this code if you're at all interested in a really ugly, badly performing website. Vue, oh, you know what? We have just enough time. I forgot we started late. Let me show you one more piece. Because there is this notion of setup script, which is an idea that is available in Vue 3.2. I don't believe it's backported to 2. I don't believe so. I'd have to check, because it's doing some magic there. So let's take this and change it to a setup script. So the difference here, if you just say script setup, is it's introducing more magic. And so what it does here is instead of having any of this, I think that's right. Is that right? Why? Oh, yes, thank you. No braces at all. There we go. So setup script says, I know that this is more complicated than it needs to be. In fact, these go away as well. So if you're worried about it, everything becomes reactive by default. Oh, and it's still complaining about that, but I'll leave that. And what it does is anything that is in this scope gets exposed for you. Now, my problem with this is that everything exposed in the scope is imported for you. And I like the idea of knowing what I'm exposing and what I'm not exposing. But a lot of people are really excited about setup script where you don't have to think about reactivity and you don't have to think about that return. Maybe like composition API, I'll come around to it, but I like to know what code is being generated. And here they're, like the options syntax, they're doing some magic that I'm not a huge fan of. But that is an option, and like I said, I've been wrong way more times than I'd like to care to admit. So maybe the setup is awesome and I'm completely wrong. But it is something you should know about, that this is supported in Vue 3 and is a simpler way to do composition API. You get all the benefits without having to worry about the plumbing as much. So for what it's worth. Any questions? I know we're ending a little early, but I ran out of code.
I just have one. I've been using script setup at work. I had no idea I didn't have to wrap things in ref. I've been doing it everywhere.
Yeah.
So that's it's not a question, but that's amazing.
Yeah, but everything gets wrapped in ref. I mean, that's the other part, right? Oh yeah, everything needs to be wrapped in ref. Though that's only in 3.2 and beyond. Before that, the setup script in the experimental phase, you need to wrap in refs. Now I'm questioning whether that's the right thing. I'll have to check. I'll tweet about it later. But yeah, yeah, I believe that's the case. I believe that's the case.
Because if you're using the composition API in Vue 2, do you have the same Internet Explorer compatibility issues you have with Vue 3 reactivity?
I don't know, to be honest. I'm not writing for IE anymore, so that hasn't come up. If it's about reactivity, probably, because they're relying on later JavaScript implementations, but there might be shims for it, but I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you. There are issues with Vue 3 and Internet Explorer, but if it's specifically about reactivity, probably yes. I don't think it's going to fix any of that, because proxy objects are ones that were always problematic in IE, and it's relying on them quite a bit here. If you've ever had a chance to play with proxies, they're fun and awful at the same time. So if you've ever had to proxy your own object. Well, thanks for coming. Let me know if you have any questions afterwards. I'm on Twitter, and you can contact me at wildermuth.com. I'm happy to follow up. And I'll have a post probably tomorrow with a copy of all the source code if you want it. It'll be in GitHub someplace. Thank you very much.
Thank you.